Welcome everyone, welcome back on the SpaceInfo Club podcast. Today we have Chris Brown with us. Welcome back on the SpaceInfo podcast. Here we talk about space and everything related to it. If you are passionate about space, astronomy, technology and everything about it, you can join all our social platforms at the SpaceInfo Club or our website at www.spaceinfo.club, where tons of content and a community of experts are there waiting for you. This is the SpaceInfo Club.
Happy to meet you and to have a conversation about this important topic.
Yeah, so maybe you'd like to tell us what you do in your life, what's your main occupation, and why we are here today.
Sure. I am what you would call classically a space lawyer, but my background is multi-generation military. My dad was a cryptologist aboard a Navy sub when I was a kid and became a space wrench for NASA. And I grew up watching space launches, being generally interested in both the past and future of the space program. I joined the military myself. I was a military policeman in the United States Army and was one of the, after my service as an enlisted person, several years later, I started college, and my principal occupation there was international relations, understanding the subtle nuances of the Cold War and the space race was a huge part of my particular interests, emerging technologies, sustainable fuels. I had an opportunity to study at the University of Reykjavik, hydrogen fuel cells, at Oxford University, and Aarhus in Copenhagen and Denmark before going to law school at UC Berkeley, where after the normal gamut during your first year of law school, I focused on international law, and my principal research and publications were associated with the collection of resources in outer space, including the moon, asteroids, Lagrange points, and Mars.
Yeah.
After that, I did some work, as many law students do, worked in a law firm for a little while, and then it was brought in as the inaugural general counsel for an engineering firm that worked with the Department of Defense, primarily high altitude missions under MATOC, the Army Corps of Engineers. A lot of our work was on Air Force bases and then eventually Space Force. I moved over after my CEO's retirement to Virgin Orbit, where I negotiated the launch contracts for multiple missions, including turning the Newquay Airport in England into Spaceport Cornwall, negotiating the grants, and working with the UKSA and the nations of the UK, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, developing a racetrack to allow the launch after the launch activities with Virgin Orbit's Launcher One rocket. And then I transitioned to Gatai, which is a robotics space company after Virgin Orbit unfortunately went bankrupt, as their inaugural general counsel. And there were some export control issues, changing their Japanese company to a Japanese American company. We inverted the ownership from Japan to the United States, and then worked with Virgin Galactic on its human space flight, principally working on the development of the regulatory regime inside of the business to abide by the Department of Justice compliance guidelines, worked on the Mothership 3 project, and with the human space flight component of my work regarding research missions, principally NASA and universities who had small payloads that would be tested in zero gravity. So, in addition to the professional element of the work, space law is kind of in the core of both my continued academic and nonprofit interests. I am a futurist, and I run a program called Project Urban Forest. It's a nonprofit. It's designed to educate youth and to provide opportunities for women and individuals from disenfranchised communities to have access to not just technologies, but also funding, so that way they can become a robust partner in this new space environment.
So you touched a lot of points, and I'm so excited to ask you about everything, basically. So you started talking about deep space, moon, and also Lagrangian pointer. I heard about it, and you ended up also with your personal experience. I would like to call it, let's say, an institution like the U.S. Army, and with the opportunity to study around the world, also in Europe, where we are now, where I am now, and also with the private sector. So maybe we can start from this last topic, which is trending these months. And so, how do you see the legislative framework about private companies, particularly nowadays?
So it's kind of an interesting thing in that the regulatory framework in the United States is governed by two things. One, the connection between how our regulatory bodies implement the Outer Space Treaty, the Liability Convention, and the other treaties that are essentially an outgrowth of the original Outer Space Treaty. And not a significant amount has changed in the decades. What I would say is that there is a greater understanding with the commercial launch providers on how to abide by the actual requirements under the various regulations, which essentially are just mirroring what it is that the United States would have to do in order to be a responsible state as a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty. And one of the interesting things that a lot of folks don't necessarily understand is that when it comes to liability issues, so if there's a mishap that causes damage to persons or property outside of the United States, that the state itself, the United States, is actually who is liable for that damage, not the individual company that is a part of those licensed launch activities. And so part of the framework, it's Part 440 under the regulations. There's a specific regime to ensure that individual launch providers are giving protections to the government, and that requires a demonstration of financial responsibility. Essentially, the FAA grants a launch license and says that you have to demonstrate that you have the finances in the event that there is damage or another incident under the terms of this particular licensed launch activity. And for each licensed launch activity, it depends on the nature of that type of launch, the location of that launch, the size of the launch vehicle, the payloads, the racetrack, the space. And so what the FAA comes up with is called a maximum probability of loss. That APL is a number that the company has to demonstrate they can financially be responsible for in the event of an incident. And the easiest way to demonstrate that your company has that APL is to get insurance to the amount that the FAA requires in order to permit a licensed launch activity. Another way would be to demonstrate that you've set aside a particular number. You set aside that amount of funds in a separate account that can be accessed in the event that there is a liability incident. I believe SpaceX currently uses that route. Companies like Virgin Galactic currently go into the insurance market and get enough coverage to cover those licensed launch activities. Virgin Orbit did the same thing before it went bankrupt. Now, beyond liability, there are always the concerns about human spaceflight. So when the big three who currently do commercial human spaceflight, which would be Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, and Origin, there's also some protections related to the actual technology that sends folks to space. However, when it comes to actual space tourism, the FAA does not currently have the ability to regulate commercial human spaceflight because it is still so new that there is not enough data for the agencies to be able to say how and in what ways these commercial spaceflight operators would actually protect the human spaceflight participants. And that has been since 2004. And every 5 years, the FAA reauthorizes that bill which is a learning period. The learning period is where the FAA and spaceflight operators are actually doing work. The latest, I do not believe it's yet signed. I believe the learning period has been extended to January 1st of 2025. And the spaceflight operators are actually asking for an extension beyond that. And we'll see what happens, but there will not be a sufficient, in my mind, there will not be a sufficient amount of data for the FAA to start regulating commercial spaceflight, especially since Virgin Galactic has paused its human spaceflight activities. Blue Origin isn't flying there at a clip, and SpaceX isn't flying humans at a clip that will provide enough data to begin regulating those activities.
So let's say I'd like to raise a question from the beginning of what you said, and then one from the last part. I start from the beginning, and yes, before you mentioned the insurances, I was going to ask you about this because I don't know, probably in Europe we are much more used to have insurances for basically everything we do. They are a lot more common experience in let's say everyday life. When you buy a car and you start driving it around the roads, you need an insurance at least to cover the, let's say, the potential damage that you could cause to, let's say, a third person if you make an accident, if there is a problem or something like that. You're not always, let's say, obliged to have an insurance on your person, but for sure you have to have an insurance or some sort of coverage towards a third person, which can be a material damage or worse. So something like surprised me is the fact that companies are not don't have necessary to have this sort of insurance, but also can let's say give let's say lock some amount of fund and use them to cover the, let's say, potential damage. And I'm very curious, for example, to know what would happen or what usually happens. Some months ago, some pieces from the International Space Station detached and hit the soil. So is that a case where a specific institution was, let's say, retained responsible for this?
So two things. First, one of the interesting things in the States is being that we're a republic comprising of 50 states, each of the states does have its own regulatory regime associated with limits of coverage for certain activities. In the United States, you must, of course, have insurance to drive a car. Some people may skirt that legally, but there are minimums that are required for individuals to drive vehicles in the United States. And that's because also there are subsidies from the federal government that in order for states to receive funding, they have to have a minimum amount of rules in order to ensure, in order for individuals to be insured for third-party liability or for direct liability to third parties. But beyond those minimum rules, then each state promulgates its own regulations associated with the risks, impacts, the political stance of an economic stance of those individual states. Now, when it comes to launch activities, because the state party itself is responsible for damage in other nations, the liability convention absolutely, at least in the United States, requires that all licensed launch activity does have a it is regulated by the FAA, and the FAA does issue a license, and each of those licenses has a maximum probability, has an NPL. And so there are absolute requirements to have third-party insurance or other ways of satisfying that NPL for every licensed launch activity in the United States and every licensed launch activity outside of the United States from an American launch service provider, because they are all still regulated by the FAA, and the FAA must still issue the license in order to allow that activity to occur. Now, that may be perceived as a barrier, but the truth is it's necessary in order to ensure that the licensed launch activities are conducted as safely as possible, and that the United States also has an ability to cover funds if it is necessary, that the United States has to pay damages to another state party. Now, although that seems like a hindrance, there's also in the United States called a reciprocal waiver claim called RWIS. And what that is that for all the individuals who are part of that licensed launch activity, if the government's involved, they are signatory, the licensed launch provider, any applicable customers that can be extended to customers who have an interest in financial or ownership interest in the spacecraft that is being launched, subcontractors that are directly involved in licensed launch activities. And what that does, the RWAC, is that it prevents those individuals who are involved together in that licensed launch activity from suing each other. Instead, it incentivizes them to get insurance in the event there is an issue. And so that way, in the event there's a mishap that causes damage, that they don't sue each other, they still have the freedom to contract their future launch missions, and they're not allowing litigation to get in the way of future activity. That's the way for the government to incentivize these commercial actors to work together to continue working on space-related activities. Now, after the threshold that's been given with your maximum probability of loss, let's say it's a $5 million insurance policy, the FAA would then seek appropriations from Congress in the event there's a mishap that's beyond the insurance coverage. And Congress, subject them to appropriations, would pay for the remaining damages because ultimately the United States, as a state party to the treaty, is ultimately responsible under the Liability Convention to any damages caused to another state, up to I believe it's approximately today's inflation about $3 billion. Anything after that would then go back to whoever is the liable party. But to be frank, if there is damage of $3 billion, I think that we would be having different conversations about commercial spaceflight. Now, the other thing that you brought up was okay. So something fell from the ISS; it damaged some private property. The liable state would be is always going to be liable for that damage. So if there is a spacecraft on orbit, and I don't want to go into the specific circumstances of the recent incidents, but I'll give some clarity. So in the event that there is some damage caused by a re-entering spacecraft, let's say it is a U.S. spacecraft that re-enters and lands in the UK, and it damages a farm, it is clear that this on-orbit spacecraft belonged to let's say it's an American company to make it not too terrible. It depends on the limit of of the insurance. It depends on what on-orbit insurance is involved there. That individual spacecraft owner may want to seek recompense from this, let's say this launch provider put it into the wrong orbit, or even if it wasn't right orbit, if there was some sort of technical fault on orbit, it would ultimately be about who's involved and whose insurance will cover it, and hopefully they would have insurance for that spacecraft for an on-orbit anomaly that ultimately causes damage on the ground. Now, a tricky thing is what happens if it's a U.S. space launch service provider. It is a U.S. Spacecraft manufacturer, and the satellite lands on a farm in Nebraska. State liability under the liability convention is liability for other nations, not for itself. And so again, we're going back to the treaty and then the insurance, and it's very difficult for it's impossible really for the individual who had damage in Nebraska to go after the governments under the treaty. What they would have to do is that they would have to sue them in tort, and they would have to prove negligence that the government, the launch service provider, or the spacecraft manufacturer did something negligently that ultimately resulted in the damages on the ground. How do you prove negligence in space? You can't exactly send a team up there and say, hey, this orbit is actually not the right orbit where it was. Like, did you actually see how, in fact, this incident occurred? And do you have sufficient amount of information to demonstrate that it was the fault of some other party to repair the damage that occurred on your property?
So yeah, I think that this would be basically impossible to prove this thing, and maybe in the future there will be a constellation of satellites just to track objects in space, something today we only make with radars for space debris, but I don't know what will happen in the future. And a question that came to my mind while you were talking. So is this the reason why, for example, the space shuttle was allowed to be piloted only by American citizens?
No. So NASA is a civilian government entity because of government funds. There are a host of reasons why the space shuttle would never be piloted by a foreign entity, not the least of which is called export control.
Okay.
The technology that is developed in the United States is designed to be maintained and protected by the United States government and its authorized contractors and civilian entities. And there are certain exceptions when it comes to access to technology to allies, but those are all protected under certain rules, under certain export control regulations, not to include even access to this information in the United States. For friendly nations, requires an STA exemption, which would allow certain technologies to be what's called exported and re-exported for non-U.S. citizens. They would all have to have individual license. They have individual exceptions that are recorded by their employer and are maintained by that employer and audited by the DDTC, and ultimately ensuring that certain technologies are not acquired by other nations. So you may or may not know, and folks may not have a definitive answer, but the then Soviet Union most likely had an opportunity to assess our space shuttle technology created with Iran spacecraft, which looks very, very similar to our space shuttles, although they did not have the amount of success that our own launch fleet had. But ultimately, flying space shuttle enterprise is not something that the United States would entertain another a non-citizen pilot to actually take the reins of. And of course, throughout the majority of the time that we've maintained a fleet, a lot of our astronauts come from the military. A lot of them were test pilots or other individuals who had special access to technologies and understand precisely how and in what ways to utilize these technologies, and were, of course, astronauts in the proper sense of the word, and that they were trained and maintained by the United States government as they progressed in America.
So I think that that seems reasonable, the whole answer. At the beginning, you mentioned the Outer Space Treaty, and let's say this legal framework, which is very similar, if not the same, of the beginning of when it was made and written. So how are private space company, the whole private sector, influencing this legal framework nowadays?
So the regulatory framework is something that's in flux, but not. There are no, I would say, disparate changes that wholly transform how the commercial space launch providers are changing their engineering methods or their mission management, the way they interact with customers, with the FAA. However, a number of the former regulations are being consolidated due to things that are duplicate, less understood because of potential conflict, into what's called Part 450. Part 450 is a new regulatory regime designed principally for commercial space launch providers in the United States. And one thing that it does a number of things, we don't have enough time to get into, but one of the most interesting things that it does is that it provides an opportunity for the commercial space launch providers to demonstrate their ability to carry out a mission from what's called from prescriptive methods to performance-based methods. Prescriptive methods are essentially the methods that the FAA and other agencies put into place that the commercial space launch provider must demonstrate on paper. They must check 100 boxes stating that they can do this, and then demonstrate in paper and in other ways that they meet the exact parameters that the FAA has put into place in order for them to be granted a launch license. What 450 does then is it takes those prescriptive methods, and for many of them they become performance-based. So if the FAA had, let's say, a particular way that a company is supposed to situate hazardous materials prior to a space launch. It says, okay, it must be conducted this amount of feet away from civilians for this amount of time. It has to have this amount of protective measures, including this amount of personnel. That would be a prescriptive method. A performance-based method looks at it from the opposite. It states, okay, these hazardous materials must be protected. That's the end goal. And then the commercial space launch provider can demonstrate the ways that it is doing in order to achieve that end goal. That may be in a way that is different than what the prescriptive methods had before. Meets the same objective, maybe even exceeds those same objectives. Now, what that does is it potentially allows a creative team on the commercial side to meet the end results of what's necessary to actually get that license, but doing it better, possibly costing less money, and potentially even deriving new methods that other companies would want to adopt because it saves money, time, and is more safe. And that's across a host of different launch activities. There are subtle nuances that may make it more difficult for the FAA to grant these licenses. The reason why is because the FAA may be used to a prescriptive model that just checks the boxes. If they check all those boxes, it's easier to get a license. The performance base does make it slightly more complicated, and that the FAA also has to use its creative juices to understand that the licensed launch activities are meeting the goals of safety, even though it's not necessarily within the wheelhouse that they're accustomed to. But it does involve our ability on the commercial side to create new methods of achieving the necessary safety and cost elements of a particular launch mission, and that could save money. It could actually save lives, and ultimately could lead to more ways to protect humans when and if the learning period comes to an end. They're making data on the performance side of being more nuanced in how we approach the licensed activities than just checking a box that's been checked over and over again without any creativity.
So, for example, for me that I come from the aviation world, this seems a sort of transition. I've already looked at the space as a sort of, let's say, extension of this world. And what you're saying now is something that I've encountered in my professional field, having what you call a prescriptive method. For example, some other call a prescriptive requirement, but I think that they're very same if they're not the same thing. So probably, as you mentioned, a creative way to, let's say, to demonstrate that you're capable of doing something is probably the future in this field, and will allow a lot of what we have now are private companies. Maybe in the future we have different teams working in institution, but I think that the essence is the same. So probably we are no more interested in checking boxing, staying inside a very fixed structure, in very fixed framework. We are interested in for example, in the same final goal, but not in the how we could reach it. But as long as we grant some minimal safety measures, performance parameters, for example. So probably this is the future, and I hope that we are going to into this direction, and maybe also the field of private property will evolve into this, and also companies will have to adapt to this thing. So I don't know how you see the future of space legislation in this side.
I really don't know. And I think that as it regards space legislation on the launch activities, we are going to see a little bit of the same in the next couple of years. Part 450, right now the FAA kind of hastily put 450 together, and will be seeking comments from industry to have a better understanding of how each of these companies are going to abide by the enforcement, which is not until March of 2026. However, almost all of the commercial space launch providers are working on that transition to Part 450. I think a lot of them are still fairly in the early stages of understanding what changes there will be, or rather how those changes will have an impact on their business, what it is exactly that they can do when it comes to performance-based meeting of these license requirements, and really having conversations internally about how to best utilize this as an opportunity. And so workshopping ideas that could potentially save money, create better in-house safety regimes, but also laying forward a path creatively that positions that company to perform well under the requirements of 450. And later this year, the FAA is gathering a host of really talented American space lawyers to discuss 450, what's called 450 Spark. And so those conversations will, part of the challenges that the commercial space launch providers have is in really coming together, hopefully in-house with consultants if necessary, to discuss what the potential upsides to moving from a prescriptive to a performance-based way of meeting the FAA's requirements in order to receive the launch license. And I really think that with some real clear understanding of how mission management occurs, how their engineering, their site layout, security methods, understanding export control, in particular for launch service providers who work with foreign customers who plan to launch on foreign soil, that they take a fine comb to their existing operations and remove as many redundancies and inconsistencies as possible, and hone in on the end objective of what the FAA is requiring under performance-based activities that could enhance the industry, ensure greater safety for those involved in the licensed launch activities, and of course also to save money while doing some really untested things moving forward. 450 Spark later this year will bring together a contingent of extraordinary space lawyers and other interested individuals in assessing potential gaps in Part 450, highlighting some strengths, and perhaps helping to fine-tune the 450 so there are as few bumps as possible when it is fully in effect in 2026, and also providing the FAA with a significant understanding of what the industry needs from them when it comes to reviewing these performance-based operations. One thing that is pretty much well known is that the FAA's resources are stretched pretty thin, and frankly, they could use a budget personnel boost to allow for a better assessment of these performance-based measures, and also to have more personnel to review these applications for licensed activities, especially as companies like SpaceX are growing so rapidly that the FAA cannot put enough attention on the remaining launch providers in a way that will increase competition and ensure that the licensed activities themselves are properly analyzed by the regulator such that we can start moving more quickly and efficiently in launching satellites to space and honoring what we are hoping to do with the Artemis Accords and moving mass and people to the moon.
Yeah, because what seems to me, but I think that probably that's what it is in reality, is that we've been used to launch satellites from Earth to our orbit, basically, and few to deep space. And putting satellites into orbit is almost a standard maneuver But what's not common and what is becoming more and more frequent, particularly you mentioned SpaceX, is launching new vehicle with new missions, with new mission profiles, doing different things. So I think that this must be very complicated to be analyzed on the regulatory framework, under the safety profile, and also you have to meet both the company's requirements. So, for example, in this case, what SpaceX aims to do, but also what the authority wants SpaceX to do on the other side. And I think there is no standard nowadays on how to efficiently perform this activity.
It can be a challenge, and one of the good things to keep in mind is that even though the FAA's resources are stretched, they're an amazing group. They're exceptionally talented. They know what they're doing. It's just they don't have enough personnel. And the way the regulations are currently drafted and produced is too slow. Even though I don't work for SpaceX, but SpaceX does design their vehicles in between launches at a pace that perhaps is just too quick for the regulator to respond to. If you agree to license a particular launch vehicle, and that vehicle is then changed radically a few months after its approval, you have to relicense it under certain circumstances, and that takes time. And that's also a good thing for SpaceX. They're learning, living on the fly. They're doing good work. They're changing the design to ensure that we've got the best technology to launch the spacecraft and also to land it, having as minimal of an environmental impact as is possible for such a large launch vehicles. But that the complexity involved with changes, the government is not at this point designed to move as fast as our commercial space launch providers.
So maybe you'd like to give us a little perspective also in what's happening inside the Virgin Galactic on this under the point of view.
So I'm here in my personal capacity, not representing any company, but I'll state that at the moment, Virgin Galactic has halted its human space flight activities while it is developing its Delta class spaceship, which is to come online in 2026 for testing.
Yeah, so I think that we are all very curious to see what will happen in the future, and I think that we have touched a lot of topics today, and I don't know if you want to say something else about this so fascinating topic. So I'm very curious about everything you said about space law, and I think it's so interesting because people usually say this argument as something that drags the development, but I don't see it like this, because you need to have a target, to have a goal to move towards, but you also need something, and also people that allows you to chase your goals. So I think this is a fundamental topic for what space will become in the future. And so I'd like to thank you so much for being here today and letting us know all these things. I hope to have you back in the future soon. So thank you, Chris Brown.
That sounds great. I appreciate it, Sebastian. I think the next topic we should discuss would be about the Artemis Accords.
For sure.
Space.
So let our public with this topic for the future. I will be very happy to talk with you again. So thank you so much.